It was a typical Tuesday morning when Karen Williams found herself in Judge John Marshall's courtroom. The courthouse, with its faded brick walls and long wooden benches, was nothing out of the ordinary. As Karen sat in the crowded room, her mind raced through the events that had brought her here. A minor traffic infraction. She had been pulled over for speeding through a quiet street while rushing to her second job. Her car, an old sedan with worn-out seats and a rattling engine, wasn't much, but it got her from point A to point B. Unfortunately, it was also a car that frequently drew the attention of law enforcement. Her appearance that morning wasn't any different from the other times she had walked into a courtroom. She wore simple, sensible clothes, a modest dress and cardigan, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She had a stoic expression, trying to hide the discomfort she felt in such a formal setting. She glanced around the room at the other people who awaited their turn. Most of them seemed nervous, unsure of what the day would bring. Karen didn't feel nervous so much as resigned. This was a place she'd been to before, and she knew how things usually went. As the courtroom quieted, Judge Marshall entered. He was a tall, older man with a neatly trimmed beard and glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His robe swirled around him as he took his seat at the bench, his gaze scanning the room with the air of someone who had seen it all. He was known in the legal community for his stern but fair demeanor. People rarely left his court feeling like they had been treated unfairly. Yet today, Karen wasn't sure what to expect. Her name was called. She stood up, straightened her dress, and walked to the front of the room. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, their silent judgments passing over her like a heavy cloud. The judge motioned for her to state her case. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," Karen said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was rushing to work. I didn't realize how fast I was going." Judge Marshall didn't look up immediately as he shuffled through a few papers in front of him. He seemed disinterested, distracted, as though he'd already made up his mind before hearing her words. Karen's heart sank. She had seen this before. The quiet dismissal, the way judges like him often seemed more focused on the paperwork than the people standing before them. After a long pause, he looked up, his gaze cold and detached. "This is your second offense in the past year, Ms. Williams," he said, his voice firm. "I'll be imposing a fine of $200. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected such a large amount. It felt unfair, out of proportion to the mistake she had made. She opened her mouth to speak but quickly closed it, not sure what words would make any difference. She had seen the way the system worked, and she knew there was little room for negotiation in this moment. Judge Marshall's gavel came down sharply, signaling the end of the proceedings. "Next case," he called, turning his attention to the next person in line. Karen stepped back, still stunned by the fine, trying to hold her composure as she returned to her seat. As she sat there, the weight of the fine settled heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just a $200 penalty. It was a reminder of how powerless she felt at times, especially in a system that didn't seem to take her circumstances into account. She'd pay the fine, of course, but the sting of injustice lingered long after the hearing ended. The drive home felt longer than usual. Karen's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale from the tension. The streets of the city seemed to blur as she replayed the scene in the courtroom over and over again in her mind. She had been in and out of courtrooms before, but today felt different. It wasn't just the fine that stung. Though $200 was a significant amount for her, it was the way Judge Marshall had looked at her. The quick dismissal in his eyes, as if her words didn't matter, as if her life didn't matter. Her car's engine sputtered, bringing her back to the present. She forced herself to focus on the road, but her mind wandered back to the courtroom, to the way she had felt so small under Judge Marshall's gaze. The people around her, many of whom were waiting for their own cases, had given her sideways glances as she sat down. She couldn't help but wonder if they had been silently judging her as well, another face in the sea of people who showed up in court too often. When she arrived home, the familiar hum of her neighborhood greeted her, quiet, Unremarkable houses lined up along the street, a sense of normalcy that comforted her even on difficult days. Karen had always found solace in the simplicity of her home, the modest kitchen, and worn-out couch where she spent most of her time when she wasn't working. Her 2 young children, Maya and Elijah, were in the living room, watching cartoons, their laughter cutting through the stillness. Karen walked inside, the weight of the fine still hanging over her like a dark cloud. She slipped off her shoes and dropped her purse onto the kitchen counter, where the unopened bills already seemed to multiply. She tried to shake off the nagging feeling of injustice, but it clung to her like a shadow. "Mom, are we going to get pizza tonight?" Maya asked, looking up from the couch with hopeful eyes. Karen forced a smile, trying to hide the frustration. "Not tonight, sweetie. We'll have to wait until next week," she replied. Maya nodded, unaware of the financial strain that Karen had been carrying for months. Elijah, her younger son, was busy with his toys, not sensing the quiet tension in the air. She went into the kitchen, opening the refrigerator to see what she could make for dinner. Her mind, however, kept drifting back to Judge Marshall and the courtroom. The fine was one thing, but it was the way he had imposed it without hesitation, as though he had written her off from the moment she stepped in front of him. It was a feeling she knew all too well, being overlooked, being invisible in a system that was supposed to work for everyone. Her fingers ran along the edge of the counter as she tried to focus on something else. She thought about the countless bills stacked in front of her, the constant juggling of work, motherhood, and survival. Every day, she fought against forces beyond her control. But this time, it felt personal. This time, it wasn't just the bills or the responsibilities. It was the feeling that the system itself had a way of stacking the deck against her. "Mom, are you okay?" Maya's voice broke through Karen's thoughts. Karen took a deep breath, forcing herself to be present. "Yeah, honey. Just tired." She smiled, even though the fatigue she felt wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a deeper exhaustion from fighting battles no one else seemed to notice. But the date was done, and she had to push forward, for her kids, for herself. Yet as she sat down at the table, the question lingered in her mind. Was there more she could do about what had just happened? Would anyone ever listen to her side of the story, or was she destined to be ignored? Just another faceless person in the system. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work, family responsibilities, and the constant hum of life that never seemed to slow down. But the fine, the way Judge Marshall had looked at her, stayed with Karen. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been unfairly treated, but what could she do about it? It wasn't like she could afford to hire a lawyer or take any drastic action. So she filed the fine away in her mind, telling herself it wasn't worth dwelling on. However, life had a way of throwing curveballs, and one morning, Karen's life was about to take a turn she never expected. She was sitting at her desk at the small federal office where she worked. Karen had been with the agency for several years, quietly doing her job as part of a team that reviewed and evaluated the performance of federal judges. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was stable, and she had come to appreciate the behind-the-scenes role she played in ensuring that justice was carried out fairly across the country. Most of the time, it was simply a matter of reading through case reports, making recommendations, and reviewing statistics. Quiet, methodical work that didn't garner much attention. That morning, she was reviewing a list of judges up for performance evaluation, something she did regularly. Each judge had a file, filled with their rulings and decisions over the past few years. As Karen clicked through one particular file, her eyes landed on a name that made her stop cold. Judge John Marshall. Her heart skipped a beat. The same Judge Marshall who had fined her for a small traffic infraction only weeks ago. She blinked, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, it was definitely him. The name was printed in bold letters at the top of his file, followed by a list of his recent decisions. Karen felt a mix of disbelief and irony wash over her. Of all the judges to be assigned to her review, it had to be him. The very judge who had looked at her like she was just another case file. As she skimmed through the file, She noticed several patterns in his rulings. Judge Marshall had consistently imposed high fines for minor offenses, particularly against low-income individuals. His sentences seemed disproportionately harsh, and Karen could tell that his approach didn't take into account the unique circumstances many of the defendants faced. The fine he had imposed on her was only the tip of the iceberg. It seemed that his decisions were often more punitive than corrective. Her mind raced as she thought about her options. She could simply complete the evaluation like she always did, neutral, unbiased, and focused only on the facts. But a part of her, the part that had felt so unfairly treated in that courtroom, wanted to do more. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about holding him accountable. Karen hesitated for a moment, then clicked on the Create Report button. As the blank page appeared in front of her, she felt the weight of the decision she was about to make. She wasn't just reviewing a judge's performance. She was holding his actions up to scrutiny. The same scrutiny that had been absent the day he imposed that fine on her. As she began to type, she knew that her report would have consequences. But she also knew that what she was doing was the right thing. And for the first time in a long time, Karen felt a sense of empowerment, a quiet confidence that her voice could make a difference, even if it was just in the small corner of the system. The decision to move forward with her evaluation of Judge Marshall wasn't an easy one for Karen. As she sat at her desk, the weight of her role as an evaluator felt more pronounced than ever. She was no longer just doing a routine review. This was personal. She couldn't ignore the injustice she felt from the fine he had imposed on her, nor could she turn a blind eye to what seemed like a pattern of harsh rulings against others in similar situations. Karen leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen in front of her. The report on Judge Marshall was taking shape, but with every sentence, she felt a growing sense of unease. She wasn't sure if she was overstepping, if her personal experience was clouding her judgment. Her job was to be objective, impartial, but it was becoming harder to separate her feelings from the facts she was reading. She paused, letting out a deep breath. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that what was happening in the courtroom wasn't just about her. It was about all the people who were caught in the same system, who didn't have the means or voice to stand up for themselves. If she could bring attention to Judge Marshall's pattern of rulings, perhaps it would make a difference, not just for her, but for others who might be silently suffering the same way. A small part of her hesitated, afraid of the possible backlash. What if she was wrong? What if the judge's actions were justifiable and she was overreacting? But deep down, Karen knew that this wasn't about individual cases. It was about a systemic issue. It was about fairness, about ensuring that the judiciary remained as unbiased as possible, particularly for those who were often overlooked by the system. She couldn't ignore the bigger picture. With newfound resolve, Karen dove back into the report, meticulously detailing the inconsistencies in Judge Marshall's rulings. She noted the high fines, the disproportionate sentences, and the lack of consideration for defendants' circumstances. As she wrote, she tried to keep her emotions in check, focusing instead on presenting the facts as clearly as possible. She knew that her findings could influence his future evaluations and potentially his career, but she couldn't allow herself to be swayed by personal feelings. This was about accountability, not revenge. The report grew more detailed, and soon Karen found herself thinking beyond the evaluation. She realized that her role as a federal performance evaluator had a deeper impact than she had initially thought. It wasn't just about reviewing judges. It was about creating a system where fairness could be upheld, where the actions of those in power could be challenged. As the days passed, Karen couldn't shake the thought that she was on the verge of something much bigger than she had ever anticipated. The quiet role she had played for so long now felt like a conduit for real change. And with each word she typed, the opportunity to make a difference, to hold someone accountable for their actions, grew clearer. The moment of truth was coming, and she had no intention of turning back. Karen sat in her small apartment that evening, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The final draft of her evaluation on Judge Marshall was ready, and with it came a rush of mixed emotions. She had meticulously laid out the facts, drawing attention to the patterns in his rulings and how they seemed to disproportionately affect low-income defendants. It was clear, based on the data, that his decisions didn't always take into account the full scope of people's lives, and that his approach leaned heavily on punitive measures rather than rehabilitative ones. But as Karen reread the report, she couldn't help but feel a tug of hesitation. She had carefully avoided personal language, focusing solely on the judge's professional conduct. But there was something about the way his decisions had made her feel that still lingered. The fine. The way he had dismissed her that day in court without a second thought, as if she were just another faceless defendant. She wasn't sure if her feelings were clouding her judgment, or if they were simply a reminder of the very real human impact his rulings had on people like her. Karen set the report down for a moment, leaning back in her chair. She thought about her children, Maya and Elijah, and the sacrifices she made every day to provide for them. She thought about her mother, who had raised her with the quiet belief that the system, while flawed, could be trusted to deliver justice. But Karen knew, deep down, that her mother had never been in her shoes. Karen had faced things her mother never had to. Things like courtrooms that felt colder than they should have and decisions made based on assumptions rather than the complexities of people's lives. This was bigger than just her. It was about the countless others who had walked through the same courtroom doors, people whose lives were affected by decisions that never considered the full context of their struggles. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from a colleague, requesting her input on another case. Karen quickly typed a response, then set the phone back down. She realized she had been stalling. This wasn't about another case. It was about a judge who had crossed her path in a moment that had awakened something in her, a sense of fairness that had been long dormant, a belief that her voice could, in fact, make a difference. With a deep breath, Karen clicked send on her report. It wasn't just a review. It was a call for accountability. She knew this would have consequences. She could already imagine the potential fallout, the questions, the scrutiny, the uncertainty about how it would all play out. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she also knew there was no going back. As she stared at the screen, waiting for the confirmation that her report had been submitted, Karen felt something shift inside her, a quiet sense of pride. She wasn't just an observer of the system anymore. She was part of the effort to ensure it worked the way it was supposed to, for everyone. And for the first time, in a long time, Karen didn't feel so invisible. It was a few days later when Karen received the email. Her report on Judge Marshall had been reviewed, and the meeting was scheduled for next week. The subject line was simple but loaded with meaning. Performance Review Discussion. Judge Marshall. As she clicked open the email, she saw that she had been invited to a conference room for an official meeting with her superiors. What she hadn't expected was the second line. Judge Marshall will also be in attendance. Her heart skipped a beat. The reality of the situation suddenly hit her. This wasn't just another review meeting. It was a meeting that would bring her face to face with the judge whose actions had affected her, and who, by sheer coincidence, had now become a part of her professional life. The thought of confronting him made her stomach churn, but at the same time, she couldn't ignore the weight of what she had done. She had submitted her report, and now the consequences of that decision were about to unfold. The day of the meeting arrived, and Karen walked into the sleek, modern conference room. The long table sat empty except for a few folders and a bottle of water. She was the first to arrive, but she didn't have long to wait. A few minutes later, the door opened, and in walked Judge Marshall, accompanied by a couple of colleagues. He was dressed in his typical dark suit, his demeanor calm, as though this meeting was just another part of his routine. He took a seat at the opposite end of the table without a word. Karen's stomach twisted. She had thought that seeing him again would stir the emotion she had felt the day he found her, but now, in the sterile setting of the conference room, everything felt more formal, less personal. The stark contrast between the judge in his robe and the man sitting across from her made it harder to connect the two. "Ms. Williams, thank you for joining us today," one of her colleagues said as they all took their seats. We've reviewed your report on Judge Marshall, and we're here to discuss your findings and any recommendations you may have for improvement." Karen nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "Thank you. I believe that fairness and consistency are vital when it comes to judicial decisions, and I've tried to provide a comprehensive review based on the data and trends in Judge Marshall's rulings." As she spoke, she couldn't help but notice the way Judge Marshall was watching her. His usual stern, impassive expression was now tinged with something else: curiosity, apprehension. She couldn't quite place it, but it was there. And then it happened. After a few more formalities, Judge Marshall cleared his throat, looking directly at Karen. His voice was measured but slightly strained. "Ms. Williams, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge something. It seems that you are reviewing my performance as a judge, and while I respect your professionalism, I realize now that we've crossed paths before." In court, Karen felt a jolt of surprise. His tone was calm, almost apologetic, but the recognition in his eyes was unmistakable. He was fully aware that she was the woman he had fined for a minor infraction. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on her. It felt as though time had come full circle, from her being just another anonymous defendant in his courtroom to her now holding his professional fate in her hands. A brief silence hung in the room, and Karen took a steadying breath. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge their past encounter so openly. It was a rare, almost human moment that made the entire situation feel more personal than she had anticipated. For the first time, Karen felt herself stepping into the role of someone who wasn't just a reviewer of facts, but a participant in a larger story, one where accountability mattered, not just for her, but for the judge who had affected her life. "Yes, Judge Marshall," Karen said, her voice more composed than she felt. "We did meet in your courtroom. I'm here to make sure that fairness is always part of the equation, even for those whose lives might seem small or insignificant." His gaze softened ever so slightly, and Karen couldn't help but wonder if he was beginning to understand the weight of her words. The conversation that followed was not what Karen had expected. Judge Marshall, though initially reserved, seemed to soften with each passing minute. It was clear that he had recognized the significance of Karen's report and, perhaps for the first time, was confronting the impact of his own decisions. His colleagues had remained silent for most of the meeting, allowing the two of them to engage in a quiet, almost uneasy exchange. "I'm sure you understand, Ms. Williams," Judge Marshall began, his voice a little more measured now, "that the law is often black and white, but human lives are not." He paused, glancing at his colleagues before continuing. "I've always believed in strict adherence to the rules. And yes, sometimes that means being tough on offenders. But I'm also learning, especially after reading your report, that there's more to it. The human element. The context." Karen listened intently, trying not to show her surprise. She had anticipated resistance, defensiveness, or even indifference from him, but instead, he was acknowledging her perspective. Still, it wasn't easy for her to reconcile his words with the fine he had imposed on her, and the way he had dismissed her in the courtroom. "You're right," she replied, carefully choosing her words. "The law is meant to provide justice, but it's also meant to be fair. A person's circumstances should be considered, whether they have the means to pay a fine or whether they're just trying to survive." Judge Marshall nodded slowly, a thoughtful look on his face. "I've always believed that consequences are necessary, but I see now that they must also be justifiable. I'm not blind to the disparities in our system. Your report has made me realize that I may have been too focused on the rules without fully considering the individuals behind the cases." The room was silent for a moment, and Karen felt a sense of quiet triumph. She hadn't expected to change his mind in an instant, but hearing him admit that he could learn and grow from her evaluation was more than she had hoped for. It wasn't just about holding him accountable, it was about creating a space for change, even in someone who had seemed so immovable. Her colleagues, who had remained largely passive throughout the conversation, now seemed to be taking in the exchange with renewed interest. One of them, a senior evaluator named David, cleared his throat and looked at Karen with a newfound respect. "Ms. Williams, David said, his tone warmer than it had been at the start. "I believe what we're seeing here is an important shift, not just in Judge Marshall's approach, but in how we all view the role of fairness in the justice system. Your findings are not just data. They're a reminder that every decision we make has real consequences for people's lives." Judge Marshall turned toward his colleague, nodding in agreement. "I believe David is right. I've let my approach to sentencing be too rigid, and I want to change that. I owe it to the people who come before me to truly listen, to understand them, and to give them a fair chance." Karen felt a wave of relief wash over her. This wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about creating a dialogue that could lead to change. She had given Judge Marshall the opportunity to reflect on his actions, and in return, he was taking responsibility. The ripple effect of that conversation could extend far beyond just this meeting. For the first time, Karen felt that her role as a federal performance evaluator had real meaning. She wasn't just documenting mistakes. She was fostering a shift toward more compassionate, just decisions. As the meeting came to a close, Karen's colleagues expressed their approval of the judge's willingness to engage in the discussion. It was clear that the evaluation had not only made an impact on Judge Marshall, but also on the team as a whole. Karen left the meeting feeling a sense of pride, knowing that her voice had helped set the stage for a new kind of justice, one that wasn't just about rules, but about understanding and empathy. Walking out of the conference room, Karen's thoughts turned to the future. She had started this journey feeling powerless, but now she saw the potential for lasting change. It wasn't just about her evaluation. It was about the ripple effect it could have on the system, on the judges, and ultimately, on the people who relied on the justice system to be fair. And that, Karen realized, was worth every ounce of effort. Weeks passed after the meeting with Judge Marshall, and the ripple effect of Karen's evaluation began to show. Judge Marshall made a public statement acknowledging the insights he had gained from his evaluation and promised to implement changes in his sentencing practices. He began attending sensitivity training workshops and joined discussions on criminal justice reform, publicly expressing his intention to reconsider how he handled cases, especially those involving low-income individuals or people facing systemic disadvantages. Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride as she watched it unfold from the sidelines. Her report had sparked something in him and in others, and it was something real. At work, Karen's role as an evaluator had also shifted. Her colleagues, especially David, had started coming to her for advice on cases where there were signs of inconsistency or bias. She felt a new sense of purpose in her role. No longer just the observer, she was now a catalyst for change within her office. Her experience in that courtroom, where she had felt dismissed and marginalized, had given her a unique perspective that she was now able to use to create positive change. But the real change came when Karen received an unexpected call from the director of her agency. "Karen," he said, his voice warm, "I just wanted to personally thank you for your work. Your report on Judge Marshall has opened a much-needed conversation about fairness and accountability. We've decided to recommend you for a more prominent role in the department, one where your voice and perspective can have a broader impact." Karen was taken aback. She had always done her job quietly, behind the scenes, never expecting recognition. But now, she was being asked to step into a role where her work could shape the future of the justice system in meaningful ways. It wasn't just about reviewing judges anymore. It was about creating an environment where fairness was a priority, where the human element mattered just as much as the law itself. "I don't know what to say," Karen replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I never imagined that something like this could lead to a new opportunity." The director laughed gently. "Sometimes, change comes when you least expect it. You've shown us that it's possible to make a real difference, even in small ways. Your work will shape the future of how we approach evaluations, and that's a big deal." Karen hung up the phone, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and disbelief. It wasn't just about the new role. It was about the way her actions had reverberated through the system. For the first time in years, Karen felt like she wasn't just a small piece of a much larger machine. She was a part of something that had the potential to create real, lasting change. As she looked out the window at the city below, she thought about the journey that had led her here. From the small traffic fine to holding a judge accountable, to the opportunity that now lay before her, it was more than she could have ever imagined. Karen had started as a quiet voice in a system that often overlooked people like her. But now she was something more. She was a change maker, an advocate for fairness, and a reminder that even one person's voice could have the power to shift the course of the system. And as she prepared for the new chapter ahead, Karen knew this was only the beginning. The work she had done had already changed one judge, one system. Now, it was time to take that momentum and push for even more. The road ahead would be difficult, no doubt, but Karen was ready. Because for the first time, she felt that she was not alone in her fight for fairness. She had a voice that could be heard, and it was a voice that was ready to make a difference.